You don't know how sweet I am. You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet. You don't know how sweet I am.
Yo, check this. I might not be what you want me to be, so you might not see what you want to see. But if you got a minute, listen to what I gotta say, cause it's a brand new year and it's a brand new day. See, there's a gap between my culture and the life that I lead, so some will call me an apple, and some a bad seed. They have no idea how my heart will bleed. Their words and attitudes are things I just don't need.
You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet.
You see, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of where I'm from. Those ones spreading racism, they're just fucking dumb. Now if you're looking at my life, and you say I've assimilated, to simplify things, just a little more complicated. See, I'm a modern day native, with a modern day life. I have modern day problems, and modern day strife. Now I hear other natives, they talk about the past, and will I do the same? Fuck that. See, I've got no time to dwell on what's already done. I've got too many things that I want to do. And they don't include knives, and they don't include guns. I'm talking about knowledge and sharing it too. See, my people need to learn how to cohabitate, get rid of the anger, and get rid of the hate. We gotta stop for a minute and learn to educate. And you'll see in the end, we all have to communicate. I know there'll be a time to make a stand and a time to fight, but if you do that, make sure the cause is right. Because if the cause is right and the cause is just, greater numbers of people will be backing you up. History has repeatedly shown to us all that united we stand and divided we fall. They were talking about natives and natives alone, because this is a big world and this world is our home. Now I've seen some beautiful people and ugly ones too, and there's no single color that comes into view. So the message I'm sending, it's not all that long. It's just, I want the human race to be stronger than strong. I said I just want the human race to be stronger than strong.
You all have to be strong.
Done it. Word.
You all have to be strong. Peace.
Zuali swagwag, Galahindi Neogeds, Wagisli Wagi, Niwakidaloda, Anidag in Gwahwenege, Ani, Bojo, Danse, Okinapi, How. For those of you who are here for the very first time, I always introduce myself in my original language, so I said, Tsugoli Sogwag, or hello everyone. Galahindi is my name, and that translates to clouds passing over in the colonial language. I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations of the Thames, and I am part of the Bear Clan. And I am welcome in. So I'm streaming from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Huron nations, which is on the treaty land called the Dish with One Spoon, in an area that we now call today southwestern Ontario, in the northern part of Turtle Island that's been segregated and relabeled Canada. Today, kind of a spontaneous stream because I just heard about this event yesterday, and so I had to register and hoped that I got my registration in time this morning. when I got. So I got the email back saying I'm registered and ready to go. So, Donaire, welcome in. Yonko for being here. Appreciate you. So this is about the Indian Act. Now, part of what many people don't understand about the Indian Act, I think, is how much it dictates what First Nations communities are allowed to do, um, what who determines who is indigenous and who is not, um, and the requirements of being part of an indigenous band. So those are questions. Also, there are some restrictions or basis of laws that allow loopholes to be created that lead to situations like the missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls and two spirits. Now, it doesn't seem like the two are connected on the base level of things. However, the reality is that without the Indian Act and its wording and limitations, um, there wouldn't be as many loopholes for people to get away with, say, killing Indigenous women, which is still an epidemic here in Canada. So that is something that still needs to be addressed, and it's a systemic issue, um, which means that until there's some sort of revamping, and some believe that the Indian Act itself should just be abolished. Um, Now, there's going to be two schools of thought on that, and one of them is if you abolish the Indian Act, you abolish any of the restrictions, and Indigenous people can be treated treated the same way as all the rest of the Canadian population. Um, whether or not that's a reality when you consider human nature and the history that we've been dealing with up until today is up in the air. So I'm not exactly sure all of the ins and outs of the Indian Act that are going to be discussed today, uh, but this meeting should be approximately 2 hours. So I'm guessing that there's going to be a space at the end for um, questions and answers. If you have something that you're curious about, you can always throw it in the chat at some point, and I will try to get it to the moderator. Now, this meeting should be starting well, right about now. So, let's see. Looks like they've opened up the meeting. I'm just waiting for them to let me in here. I'm gonna get my face off the screen here. Now, just because of the way my technology sometimes works, I'm hoping that you'll hear me if I talk in the meeting. Um, but if not, let me know in chat if for whatever reason you're not able to hear me. Hey, Sister Tina, welcome in. Yonko for being here. And sorry I didn't say hello to J Ray. Welcome. Appreciate you coming in. As the new people arrive, just to let you know, we're just waiting for a meeting to start here. We're covering today a discussion over the Indian Act. It's called Indian Act 101, and looks like it's about to start. Kayuwani kayuwe, kayuwani kayuwe, wehiyo, hawi wehiyo, hawi kayuwani kayuwe, kayuwani kayuwe, wehiyo, hawi wehiyo. Kayuwani
Good morning, everyone. Just wanted to welcome all of you at this time. We haven't started quite yet. Just waiting for Dawn to log on. She just sent me a message. Her computer's just a little bit slow this morning. So we're just going to continue to wait for her. Oh, Dawn's there. Holy, I just saw you. Completely missed you there. Okay, I guess we can get started then. Ignore what I just said, everyone. Wipe that out of your memory. But Sego, Sewagwego, Anibojo, Tanse, Hanik, Chinti Hoshliteyet, Manilhan, Oshinikul Neheyeyi. Hello, everyone. For those that don't know me, my Spanish name is Maria Montejo. I am the manager for Dodem Kanonhsa, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you this morning. I am so incredibly grateful that we are given the opportunity to have these very important conversations. And I wanted to share with all of you before we begin that the way that I was raised, the way that I was taught was always to offer up that tobacco before you do anything right in the morning. So in the morning, I burnt some tobacco, just extending greetings and gratitude, of course, to the natural world, the life sustainers, to the life force that moves through all of us, that breath that allows us to all come together, and also extending greetings and gratitude to the unique spirit and soul that is Dawn Maracle, and giving thanks for the willingness Dawn has to come and share important information for all of us this morning, asking that her heart and mind be in a good place and feel good, and that she be taken care of. And also offering that tobacco to extend greetings and gratitude to all the residential school survivors and all those who didn't survive, those ancestors who have passed now to the sky world. And just giving thanks, because I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I really believe that the courage and resiliency of the survivors have allowed all of us, have created a space for all of us to engage in important conversations, and the effects that it will have for humanity are profound and important. So always offering that tobacco for all the work that they've done. And so I'm very thankful to be here. And I wanted to just say, if we for any reason get disconnected, just log right back on in 5 minutes. And if you have any questions or concerns, you can private message me in the chat. I'll be taking care of that. Yeah, so aside from that, I want to say Sego to Dawn and Yawagoa for being here. And I'm so grateful to you. And I'm just going to give you sharing authority, and I'll pass it on to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me again today. It's such an honor to do work with you, you know, over all these years, decades, actually. And always an honor to be here and to share, you know, what we know with people. And so Sego Zewagwego, Dawn Maracle Yungyat, Skungwe Huege Yangahaga, Gediri Wawayansta, Toronto Nigidero. So again, my name's Dawn Maracle. I'm from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, and I sit with the Bear Clan, but I currently live in Toronto, which is still part of my traditional territory as a Haudenosaunee woman. The Six Nations have had this as part of our traditional territory since time immemorial. And, you know, part of our traditional territories include what is now Quebec, part of Southern Ontario, across to Southern Ontario, south of Ottawa, and into parts of Ohio, New York State, Northern New York State, and Pennsylvania as well too as Quebec, and back to Quebec. And so this area has been, you know, part of our lands. And so I feel very connected to this land here in Toronto, or Toronto, or what we call here, you know, where the sticks are in the water. And there are a lot of teachings here, and traditional and ancient information to be taught to our people and to all the people who are here today, as well as modern information and treaties and relationships as well too. So I'd like to honor all of that as well too. So welcome to everybody, Sego Zewagwego. So hello and welcome to everybody. And I'd also like to say that I will have a PowerPoint presentation today, but if you are able, either on another tab on your computer, or some people will also maybe use their phone or an iPad if they have a separate device, to log into Mentimeter.com, because we will also do some polls on Mentimeter. And so Mentimeter.com, I'll put it in the chat right now. And on Mentimeter.com, it'll ask you for a code, and that code is 4627-4816. So that's in the chat. Again, it's Mentimeter.com, and it'll ask you for a code 4627-4816. You won't be able to do anything with it, just asking you to log in. We won't be able to do anything until we get to those actual pages in the presentation. And I love how some people have already started. I always ask people when we're doing online work, as well as in person, to share where they're calling in from. And so I love that Telayudi and Shahzad and Anali have shared what traditional territories they're calling in from today. And so I encourage more of you to also share that, as I will move into sharing land acknowledgement from Toronto as I share my presentation as well too. So you can share those in the chat. Can everyone see my screen? Can you see it, Maria?
Yep.
Okay, great. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is just a little bit about the myth of Canada the Good, and why really everyone needs to understand the Indian Act now, why it's more important to all of us to start to understand this and its impact on how it's shaped all the relationships and institutions in Canada today. So a little bit about me. I'm just going to move this over so I can see my slide. Everyone can see my slides. So I'm Kanonhsa woman, mother of a wonderful 16-year-old daughter. We were both Bear Clan. I have a dance background, so I have danced since I could walk. And I still do some professional dancing today, even though I live with invisible disabilities. I do a lot of advocacy in IDEA. I'm a Jedi of IDEA, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And I'm a corporate speaker. I'm a CEO of 2 different companies. Well, 3 different companies actually. So there's a Skyroots Indigenous Education, as well as Hope's Indigenous Training Network, which stands for Healing Our Peoples Through Education, Sports, and Social Justice. And I've co-founded a number of other powerful women's groups, as well as Indigenous women's groups and international women's groups. And I'm also a Kairos blanket exercise facilitator and master corporate trainer as well too. So that's just a little bit about me and the context that I'm coming to you with today. So I'm going to share a land acknowledgement that I've put together. And just to let you know, I'm deeply grounded in my community, as well as in many Haudenosaunee and Indigenous communities across Canada and internationally. I've traveled to numerous Indigenous communities around the world and worked with them around the world. And as both a community person who's been learning my traditions for most of my life, as well as an academic, this land acknowledgement has been put together through traditional knowledge, oral history, archaeological, anthropological information, as well as journals from the 1700s and 1800s, as well as orthographic map making information. I've used multiple sources to put this land acknowledgement together, so shared from multiple peoples with Indigenous knowledge. And Toronto is on the traditional territory of Haudenosaunee-speaking nations, such as the Wendat, Peyton, Seneca, and Mohawk, and was more recently joined by the Mississaugas of the Credit. This place has many ports, including where the Humber and Rouge rivers and waterways meet, such as Lake Ontario. Ancient longhouses have been found along both of these rivers and in the north of Toronto as well, such as York, and those ones in the north are Wendat. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee or Six Nations Confederacy and the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and the resources around the Great Lakes. This agreement spans across southern Ontario and across the St. Lawrence and into the northern United States. So while this agreement, the Dish with One Spoon, is often misunderstood, it's an agreement that the Haudenosaunee have used for over a millennia. Originally in the 1100s with other nations on what would now be the state side, to allow them to peaceably come through our territories when we had other treaties or agreements with them, to peaceably come through our territories to hunt, to travel through, to visit their families or trading networks on the other side. And the idea is to put down all sharp implements by the fire when they're traveling through. It's called the dish because the dish is the environment. And there's only one spoon because, and the spoon came into the agreement much later, but the spoon idea is that it's smooth and it's rounded, so there are no sharp edges. And when people put all their sharp implements down, it means that no harm can come to anyone else. It's an agreement of peace and mutual respect, and that people can dig into the earth and take what they need to survive while they're traveling through Haudenosaunee territories, and that they take only what they need and leave enough to pass the spoon on to the next person. It also speaks to stewardship, so respect also of the environment. And then the spoon can continuously be passed on to the next person and the next person and the next person, and eventually be passed down through the generations for the next 7 generations. So this is a deeply important agreement. It was signed with the Anishinaabe in 1685 in Cataraqui, which is just next to current day Kingston. And that's where the Anishinaabe came into this agreement. We wish to further acknowledge that the land in Toronto in which we live and work has been impacted by multiple trade routes, intercultural exchanges, treaties, and agreements over thousands of years, including the Purchase Agreement, otherwise known as Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa communities around the further outer edges of the current day metropolis. So by living and working here, we all have a responsibility to the land, the water, and each other, to treat each other with peace, friendship, respect, as well as the environment. This means we have responsibilities to honor, renew, consistently uphold the values and relationships outlined in the treaties. And that's not just for the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, that's for everyone who lives and works in these territories. And we all have a responsibility to do this. By engaging in Indigenous practices of acknowledging Indigenous peoples' land, water, environment, relationships, and treaties, honor protocols which are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. It speaks to peace, gratitude, working together with good minds, and it's only one step towards reconciliation. So today, of course, Toronto is home to Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including status, non-status, Inuit, and Métis, alongside immigrants, refugees, and settlers. So let us all come together today in an atmosphere of respect and peace to do good work together with good minds. It's good to start our events in ways that ground us and give us an opportunity for mindfulness. It's an act of acknowledgement, gratitude, inclusion, respect, and critical allyship, and moves us towards reconciliation as mentioned in the 2015 TRC calls for action. So let's start building strong and healthy relationships with each other and the spaces which we inhabit in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. All Mohawk words, by the way. So let's hold our minds together in kindness today as we do this work together. So Nyongagoa, big thank you. And I just wanted to say as well too, feel free to put comments into the chat. Maria will be watching the chat. I can't see the chat while I have the presentation up, but if there's a point where Maria needs, if there's enough comments where she wants to stop and we can ask questions, that's great. Otherwise, we've left half an hour at the end from 1:30 to 2 for us also to have discussion and do Q&A as well too, just so everybody knows. There's lots of space for us to engage as well. And what's really important is for us to not just share land acknowledgements, it's also for us to talk about why we do them. And this is the piece that's most often missing. Because I was part of the TDSB putting together their land acknowledgement a number of years ago. But my daughter explained to me when she was in junior school that most of the students didn't pay attention, and neither did the teachers. They kind of got used to listening to it over the PA, but they didn't know why they were listening to it. And I often see this in post-secondary institutions as well as corporate environments as well too. And when people understand why things are happening or what their personal connection is to it, it might give them an opportunity to feel connected to that in a much more meaningful way. And this might help alleviate some people tuning out from the opportunity to create meaningful engagement with people. And so let's look at a few points. Land acknowledgements are an act of acknowledgement on whose territory we live and work. They're an act of humility as well as history. So acknowledging that unless we are Indigenous, we weren't here first, and that a colonial process has happened here. And so if we're not Indigenous and not from this place, we might have benefited from that and other colonial processes. And Canada is still very, very much in its infancy in understanding this point. It's an act of understanding one's own positionality in relationship to colonization and to Indigenous peoples, which might help us to understand our own privileges and biases. And that's an opportunity for us to learn and to grow and to help build discussions and build our relationships with Indigenous peoples, organizations, and communities. It provides us with an opportunity to know how we step on Mother Earth and to reflect on that and on whose territories we're stepping on as we begin to build those relationships. with people who've held long and deep relationships and identities within these territories. And again, it's only one of many, many, many steps towards critical allyship and reconciliation. So anyway, welcome. I'm so glad that all of you are here, regardless of your exposure to the Indian Act so far and its effects. So this presentation is for people of varying backgrounds of understanding in relation to the topic. And I welcome everyone in today's webinar, and I'm honored that you've chosen to spend some time with us today. And so right now, I'm going to ask you to go over the Mentimeter. For those of you who can, go over to Mentimeter. And I am just going to, oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. Hop over there myself. Where are you in your learning journey about Canada's relationship with Indigenous people? So you can say that this is your first step. You've begun, but you've got a bit farther to go, or any of the other options that are there. Now, can you all see on the screen how the chart is changing?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, good. Mentimeter is quite fun to watch in real time. So it looks like the majority of people, so far 14. So if anyone hasn't gone in there, I'm just giving a last call here. 15 people say they've begun learning about the Indian Act, but they have a long way, or their journey with, with their relationship within Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, but they have a long way to go. And about half of that say they've had some teachers and learned from them. And there's about 3 people that say it's their first step, or they feel able to support others on the journey. Okay. There's one more, so I want you to stay on Mentimeter. Where are you on your learning journey regarding the Indian Act? So you could say you've never heard of it, you've heard of it, that's all. You know it's about Indigenous people, you know it's legislation, or you know quite a lot about it. Okay, so wow, overwhelming majority say that you know it's legislation governing Indians and reserves. That's great. So we'll go back to the presentation. We'll just stay there for now. Understanding the Indian Act today. So today, what we're going to do is we're just going to begin to learn some of the reasons why it's important for all settlers and Indigenous peoples to understand the Indian Act. And the philosophies which built the Indian Act 1.5 centuries ago continue to inform and influence our institutions, attitudes, behaviors, and relationships, whether we realize that or not. It's very intrinsically influential on all of us as individuals and the systems within our society still today, very, very much so. And the government of Canada has become a rich country today based on the systematic racism that is entrenched in our governance, education, health, policing, and other systems. So many words come to mind when thinking about the Indian Act for me. And so we're going to talk about a number of terms throughout the webinar, and I'm going to be covering a lot of terms throughout our time together today. So I just wanted to go over a number of terminology that I'm going to be using, just so that you understand what I'm meaning when I'm using this terminology. So when I use the term Indian, which I will be using today, I'm speaking about it as a historical term, which was historically used to describe Indigenous people of the Americas, specifically North America. And I'm also be using it in a legal context. So it's still a term that the government of Canada recognizes. It's legislation. So I am for example, a status Indian. Both of my parents are status Indians from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, so otherwise known by the government as the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. That's the government's name for my reserve. That's not our community name, but that's what the government identifies us as. And so Indian is a legal term identifying that the government of Canada recognizes me as a status Indian who can live on a reserve, be on a reserve membership list, and access services for Indians. So it's a historical term and a legal term. Aboriginal was more commonly used in the 80s and 90s to refer to anyone of Indigenous descent, but it is also a legal term. So Aboriginal is a term that's entrenched in our 1982 Constitution, and it refers specifically to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people as well too. Native was a term more colloquially used in Canada in the 90s and 2000s to refer to Indigenous peoples. And here are the terminology for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, according to Canada and the groups themselves. So First Nations refers to status Indians in Canada, those who are recognized by the government of Canada, those on a membership list on a reserve, or the membership list belongs on a reserve, but people can either live on or off reserve. And a reserve, First Nation also sometimes refers to the reserve itself, the place. There are Inuit people, and so this refers to Native peoples of the Canadian Arctic and Greenland. And the term itself comes from the Inuktitut language. Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Aboriginal peoples, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and who is accepted by the Métis Nation. And a Métis person can trace their family tree to an ancestor connected to specific communities, such as the Red River Métis. This definition was pulled from the Métis Nation of Canada, although there are additional Métis groups who have their own definitions as well. I think that's important to point out and important for you to understand. There are additionally non-status Indians. And so these are Indigenous peoples who are not recognized by the government of Canada to fit into any of the previous categories. And there are organizations that support urban Indigenous and non-status Indians, or we would today say Indigenous peoples, but historically Indians. Reserve is a Canadian term meaning the land the government of Canada says a reserve is land that it has set aside for Indians, historically. However, it was Indigenous land, so it's a bit ridiculous that they're called reserves but Canada still uses this terminology, land that it has reserved for Indians. And so that's why we call them reserves in Canada. In the States, they're called reservations. And so a lot of people interchange these terminologies. However, the correct terminology is reserve in Canada and reservation in the States, but they mean similar things. One is just a Canadian term and one is just an American term. So in the beginning, there was quite a lot of cooperation and support between Indigenous people and newcomers for the most part in Canada, as opposed to South American and Central American countries. There's quite a marked difference in behavior at various points in history as the numbers of settlers slowly increased across southern Canada. The settlers and their leaders recognized First Peoples as having their own ways of doing things, their own governments, laws, and territories. They recognized Indigenous peoples as being independent nations with whom the newcomers could share and make treaties. These treaties explained how they were going to share the land and the water, the animals and the plants. I just have to take a sip of water. So what is a treaty? This becomes really important in our discussion and our work moving forward here, because a treaty is not what Canada has led you to believe a treaty is. And our education systems historically have certainly not done a good job of educating us on the actual definition or international definitions of treaties. So a treaty is actually a nation-to-nation agreement, whereby the nations signing that agreement have an absolute recognition and acknowledgement that the nation on the other side of the treaty is equal. So what that means is that the Indigenous nations signing those early treaties were seen as equal to the English, equal to the Dutch, equal to the French, for example. And so if there's no recognition of this equality of a nation-to-nation agreement, then it's not a treaty, it's just a contract or an agreement. It's important for you, I ask you to take this in, and this is a really crucial point for you to understand in anything to do with Indigenous relationships of any kind whatsoever. This is a really crucial point. And that there are over 300 numbered treaties across Canada and more treaties with names, not numbers. So one of the first treaties with the newcomers was the Two-Row Wampum. And this was originally signed with the Dutch in 1613, so over 400 years ago, and the Haudenosaunee. And then it was later re-signed with the British, and then re-signed many, many, many times with the British. These aspects, so this is what it looks like. And although I've heard some of our hereditary chiefs speak about the translation of this wampum belt over a period of days, that is not my role here today. Today, I will only just speak very, very, very briefly about this. But I encourage you to learn much more about the Two-Row Wampum because I consider it a foundational treaty on which many, many other treaties were built upon. And you'll see here that there are 3 sets of white rows and 2 sets of purple rows. And if you look at one purple row, this represents the Haudenosaunee traveling down a river in a canoe. And the other purple row represents a ship with the newcomers traveling along the Haudenosaunee down that river, but with a buffer zone in between. And so with the 3 sets of white rows, using the principles that were specifically articulated in those speeches and within the agreement of peace and friendship and respect, the Haudenosaunee agreed to allow the newcomers to stay in our territory, to share our land. Because what happened was one day they came upon the Dutch in upstate New York, what is today upstate New York, building in our territories. And after they came to find a way to speak each other's language and understand each other, this is what resulted. And the Haudenosaunee only agreed to allow the newcomers to stay on our land as long as they agreed to abide by these values of peace, friendship, and respect forever, but also very, very specifically that they agreed to not interfere in our affairs, that we would govern our own nation, that they would govern their own nation, and that we would stay in our ship, our canoe, and that they would stay in their own ship. So they could only stay on our territory, both the Dutch and the English, if they governed themselves and didn't interfere in our affairs, and we would govern ourselves and our nations and not interfere in theirs. So this was one of the most foundational and crucial treaties in the history of North America. It straddled both sides of what is today the Canadian border, but it pre-existed the Canadian-American border. And so it's applicable to both sides today. When it has been renewed, this Two-Row Wampum, we call it the covenant chain. And it's been renewed many, many times. And it's just a reiteration of the two-row, a renewal of those principles and agreements. And in the 1700s and 1800s, the English government in the New York, or New York State, as well as the US, and on the Canadian side of the border as well, have repeatedly agreed to uphold the two-row and signed multiple covenant chain agreements. This has also happened in the 1900s and even in the 2000s. And so the idea is to constantly renew and uphold this treaty. And this is really important because for Indigenous peoples, treaties are special and sacred agreements that are meant to go on in perpetuity and to be renewed so that humans, because we have a tendency to forget our responsibilities, to be reminded of our responsibilities and for those relationships to be renewed. And this is a very, very different concept than the European concept of treaties, where, for example, the Treaty of Paris would be signed on a piece of paper and that piece of paper would be put away, not necessarily to be revisited. So the worldviews of Indigenous peoples and the newcomers, we know have been and continue to be very, very different. And this continues to impact all of us, our institutions, our relationships, the conflicts we have, and our health, education, and economic outcomes continue on to this very, very day because of that. So I'm going to ask you to head back to Mentimeter. So now you've heard a little bit about the Tura Wampum. I'm going to ask you what words come to mind. And you can put in multiple submissions of words. I think 3 or 4 words or sets of words you can input. Wow, can everybody see this? Maria, can you still see it?
Yes.
I love word maps. They're so beautiful.
They are. Yeah, I was looking at it. I was like, wow.
And they're always different and unique based on every group is different and unique of people. And you can also put in a word that's already there. The words that stay the biggest are the words that people contribute the most.
Oh, okay. So things like respect is like, that means a lot of people wrote that.
Yeah, like peace, friendship, and respect were the 3 principles.
Ah, okay.
Of the treaty. Oh, I love this. It's so beautiful. So it's still moving around, but I'm seeing peace, respect, sacred, coexistence, sharing, commitment, generosity, autonomy. I like autonomy. Everlasting, peacekeeping, commitment, coexistence, empowerment, sovereignty, nation to nation, broken, but yet harmony, sacred, understanding, nation to nation relation. That's a lot of TIONs. Okay, this is my last call for submissions. I'll just give a few more moments because it's still moving. Legally binding, absolutely. It is absolutely legally binding. Yes, because it was a nation-to-nation agreement and re-agreed upon many times. Okay, this is my last call. Oh, it's almost in the shape of a heart right now. Get your last ones in. Eternal. I like that too. Peacekeeping. Yep. Expectations of equality. Absolutely. Fairness. Yep. I think even after I go off of it, you might still be able to input. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm going to pop back over to the presentation now. And so we're going to move from 1613, about 150 years, okay? So this relationship continued to develop. More and more settlers came to Canada, of course, over that 150 years. And this continued to have a big impact as they took up a lot of space in our communities and territories. And we also know that many Indigenous people suffered from diseases, and estimates say that between 50 and 250 million Indigenous people died from the diseases that the newcomers brought with them. And so I will say that again, between 50 and 250 million Indigenous people died from the diseases that the newcomers brought with them. So that's what some estimates say. And I personally find it appalling that most North Americans have no idea about this. But we all know about the Holocaust and the Shoah. Well, most people don't even know about the Shoah, but we know about the 6 million people who died in the Holocaust. Some of us also know about, it was actually 10 million between the Holocaust and the Shoah. But most of us don't know about the 50 to 250 million Indigenous people who died from coming into contact with the Europeans. And so this is really important for us to know and understand, because between 1613 and approximately the 1800s, our communities were significantly decimated, and our systems of trade and governance, our institutions and our structures were significantly impacted compared to the strength that they had before. So that brings us to 1763, to the Royal Proclamation, where King George III of England said that Indigenous nations own their lands. And he recognized that the only legal way, so he stated this in the agreement, the only legal way that newcomers could own their lands was by making treaty agreements between the two nations. So treaty making process, again, this idea of equality still existed in 1763, and in which Indigenous nations would consent to the purchase of their lands in exchange for something else. And this was issued on October 7th, 1763. Following Great Britain's supposed acquisition of French territory in North America. But then how did the French acquire that territory after the end of the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War? And so that's what preceded the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And so it's really important for all of us to understand the Royal Proclamation of 1763, because it is also, it's not just the two-row wampum. That's a really crucial piece of Canadian history for all of us to understand, but so is the Royal Proclamation, because the Royal Proclamation is also embedded in Canadian law. It acknowledges pre-existing Indigenous sovereignty, that we were already nations, that we already had sovereignty, that we already had territories and rights. And so all of this is very, very important for us to know and understand. And that's why it's important. So all that King George did was acknowledge that we had all of these things. But because it was acknowledged in a document that was legal to the Brits, and then it having been embedded in later documents like our 1982 Constitution, it is still relevant today. Here's what it looks like if you Google it. However, I want you to be really careful about what source you Google it from. So while in the middle, there's a picture of the actual proclamation, I want to point your attention to the data that's on the left-hand side, because this particular source comes from the Government of Canada website. And it says, on October 7th, 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation for the administration of British territories in North America. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 set out the core elements of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown, established the recognition of First Nation rights in Canada, and laid the foundation of the treaty-making process. So none of that is true. I just want to point out to you. So always know your source and always know the bias of your source. So it says the Royal Proclamation set out the core elements of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown. Not true. Our early treaties did that. For example, the two-row wampum did that. That set out the core elements of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown, i.e. peace, friendship, and respect, and not interfering in our affairs. That's what set out the core elements of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown. And then later this says it established the recognitions of First Nations rights in Canada. No, it did not. The actual Royal Proclamation already acknowledged pre-existing rights in Canada prior to Canada. So pay attention to sources about historical documents and what they actually say about it. Be critical, be thoughtful and reflective, and always use multiple Indigenous sources for such documents. I highly, highly encourage, and always be highly critical of Government of Canada resources because they are extremely biased and in this case, extremely incorrect. So if we move from 1763, about a century later, to what became known as the British North America Act of 1867, or otherwise known as the Constitution Act. So you may remember a few years ago, Canada celebrated its 150th anniversary or birthday. Not everybody celebrated, mind you, but they were referring to this. They were referring to the British North America or Constitution Act of 1867. And so while this talked about a number of things, I'm only going to refer to what's relevant to the talk today. So what it did was it put Indians and lands reserved for Indians, again, Canada feeling it was reserving land for Indians, under the jurisdiction or control of the federal government. So prior to that, jurisdiction of relationships with Indigenous peoples belonged to regional governments. And so what that meant was that governments negotiating with or dealing with Indians were local. And so that they knew local issues. They had some level of relationship with those Indigenous people and some level of relationship with that ecosystem, with that environment. However, in 1867, when this relationship changed to a federal jurisdiction, the people making decisions about us started to become so much more removed from Indigenous people that they were no longer in relationship with each other. And so when this happened, Indigenous people lost rights and control over our lands to an immense degree. And Indigenous people, of course, were not at all consulted or involved in the creation of this law that would have such a huge impact over our lives. And early treaties like the Turo Wampum were severely broken and ignored at this time because they were interfering in our affairs, for example, and they were not using any of the values such as peace, friendship, or respect at this time. So this marked a massive, massive shift from this original nation-to-nation relationship to this assumption by the British of power over Indigenous peoples and their lands. And there was no justification whatsoever for this, no agreed upon nation-to-nation arrangement for this sudden change. They just assumed supremacy over Indigenous people. And they started practicing it, even though they started before this, they put it into their law, British law at this point. And so Indigenous communities and territories went from being what we had always been, strong and Indigenous run with our own languages and governments, treaties, conduct, protocols, and gender roles and ceremonies, to these externally designed, isolated, and poor communities that were designed to be disbanded and depended on the government for nearly everything. And that is exactly how the system was designed, on purpose. Indigenous peoples were never meant to have survived this long. As far as the worldview and political intentions of the government. And Indigenous peoples were meant to have little to no interaction with settlers. That would be too inconvenient for the system of Canada that was being created. And so within a few years, all the existing laws dealing with Indigenous peoples were gathered together and put into the Indian Act in 1876. So they were just amalgamated into the Indian Act. And so as long as Indigenous peoples were strong, it was difficult for the government to take Indigenous lands. And so in response, the government used the Indian Act to attack who we were as a people. And this happened gradually over time and continues to this day. And this happened mostly in the form of amendments to the Indian Act. They would keep making amendments to attack us more by outlawing things such as fishing and hunting, or limiting them, as well as spiritual ceremonies like the powwow, potlatch, and Sundance, music, dancing, and smudging, and certain methods of farming even became outlawed and against the law. And this didn't change until the 1950s. And in many ways, this still hasn't changed. For example, the government's trying to impose the First Nations Governance Act. Indigenous people didn't want this, but the government has still imposed it. The government trying to impose pipelines in Indigenous communities where Indigenous communities have forbidden it and fought it. The government has forced it upon us anyway. So this continues to this day and continues to be very, very relevant. So we're going to pop over to Mentimeter again. Well, it's funny that the word cloud looks like a heart still. So rank these legal frameworks governing relationships between Indigenous peoples and the settler state. So 1 being the least harmful and 4 being the most harmful. This one does not look like it's moving too much. So, oh, wait, it just moved. Last call. Yes, I would agree with this for a number of reasons. So one is our nations were very strong. Of course, we were still in our original state or very close to our original states when the newcomers first came. And so we negotiated from a position of strength in the beginning. Also in the beginning, newcomers knew that they needed our help to survive. And so they recognized us as equals so that we would help them survive. We knew what was medicine and what wasn't. We knew how to survive harsh winters. We knew what was medicine and what was poison. We could help them learn. And so those early treaties were based on a system of equality. And the Royal Proclamation acknowledged us as being equal nations, as being having pre-existing sovereignty. And then, you know, the British North America Act started to exercise supremacy, and then the Indian Act became even more harmful. So you are all correct on that point. So the purpose of the Indian Act, government legislation on Indians was aimed at assimilation, and there's no soft way to say this. It was aimed at separating them from settler society in order to take advantage of as many lands, resources, and the economy as much as possible. In the 19th century, the goal of the government was to make Canada's Native cultures disappear. It was expected that Native people would be assimilated or die from the either directly from fights or starvation, meaning that they, or in the assimilation, that they would just give up their own culture, languages, beliefs, and become Christian and live and act just like British settlers. So this was expected because life on reserves was designed to be untenable. So for example, when they built towns where settlers came, they created infrastructure for towns because they wanted it to last a long time and they wanted more and more people to come. But they did not design infrastructure for reserves because they didn't anticipate people lasting very long. They also often built reserves next to dumps, next to polluted grounds, often by swamps, often in rocky areas. There's much evidence to identify this. Also, Indian agents were assigned to each community for the purpose of controlling and manipulating Indigenous peoples, ensuring we didn't discuss our rights, speak our language, or organize to keep our land or our rights. And reserves in the Indian Act were designed to again, and I can't emphasize this enough, to separate us from settlers, and so that they could stop us from being very much in relationship with each other. And this made and continues to make it easier for settlers to believe the rhetoric and propaganda by the Canadian state against Indigenous peoples, such as, for example, something that continues to perpetuate shockingly in some areas of society, that Indians are to blame for their position in society, which is a complete fallacy. But yet there are some people who still believe that this is true. And this is completely based on Canadian propaganda. So through the Indian Act, the federal government has continued to this day to deny Indigenous people their basic rights. And these are things that other Canadians take for granted, such as healthy schools, proper housing and infrastructure, and clean running water. So nearly a quarter of all reserves in Canada still don't have clean drinking water. And this is not an issue of remoteness. For example, there are parts of Six Nations, Tyendinaga, and Georgina Island that still don't have access to clean drinking water, even though all the municipalities around them do have clean drinking water. So I often hear from people, oh, that's just because it's just remote communities, right? No, it is not. There's absolutely no reason for this to happen. And so what that tells us is that this is a direct result of apathy, racism, lack of political and citizen will. Because the issue of clean drinking water has been in the news for decades. It has absolutely been at the forefront of news for the last decade. And as an example, when Trudeau ran for office the first time, young Trudeau, he said that the first thing he was going to do when he came into office was make sure that all reserved had clean drinking water. So he said that was the first thing he was going to do when he got into office in 2015. And it still hasn't happened yet. And yet he's been reelected how many times? So in government studies, we learn that the people are the government. So the people actually do have the power to put pressure on government to make these changes. And we also know that Canada has, oh, I just forgot the name of it. I think it's called a CERT team. It's like an Army emergency CERT team that goes into disaster regions around the world, for example, after a cyclone, after a hurricane, and they drill and can create like a pump with clean drinking water in emergency zones within 24 hours. So if Canada sends these disaster teams around the world to emergency disaster zones and can get clean drinking water in 24 hours, why don't they do that to reserves in Canada, some of which who've gone 70, 80, 90 years without clean drinking water? I ask you this and encourage all of you to talk to your MPs about this. So we're going to pop back over to Mentimeter. I understand that the Indian Act is. So you have 5 options here. the legal framework of Canadian relations to Indigenous nations, the modern equivalent to treaties in need of amendments, a statute that concerns registered Indians, their bands and reserves, or in violation of treaty agreements. Now you might want to check, it should say in your instructions. I'm not sure if you can pick more than one. Last call. Great. So correct in that it is all the three things on the right. It is in need of amendments. And of course, there are advocates for it to be decimated. There needs to be other agreements in its place, though. It is a statute that concerns registered Indians, their bands and reserves, because it only it is legislation that only applies to status Indians. So it doesn't apply to any of the other groups of Indigenous people. So it only applies to status Indians. Even though it impacts all of us, it only is, the legislation only directly impacts status Indians or governs Indigenous status Indians, even though it impacts all of us. And it is absolutely in violation of treaty agreements. That's right. Thank you. So we're going to go back. Oh, don't go to the next one. Oh, good. I think I went back one. So. Okay. So this is what it says on the Government of Canada website. It's good for a laugh. The Indian Act, an act respecting Indians, is a Canadian statute that concerns registered Indians, so status Indians, their bands, and the system of Indian reserves. First passed in 1876 and is still in force with amendments. It is the primary document which governs how the Canadian state interacts with the 614 First Nations bands in Canada and their members. Throughout its long history, the Act has been an ongoing source of controversy and has been interpreted in many ways by both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. The legislation has been amended many times, including over 20 major changes made by 2002. Of course, they need to update their website. So there's too many double entendres there for me to even address. But I challenge that the entire existence of the Indian Act is an absolute breach of our original treaties, such as the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Two-Row Wampum, and it's therefore completely unlawful, not to mention unethical. Feel free to put any comments about that in the chat and about how you feel about that either way. And so what we're going to talk about just for the remaining time that we have together here is just some prominent components of the Indian Act. Of course, there are components about lands, about reserves, and about memberships, but we are for the most part, not going to talk about those today. What I want to talk about is restrictions. And so overall, Canada, after it took nearly 99.6% of all the land in what is now the country and alienating it from Indigenous peoples while paying for very little of it, despite the Royal Proclamation saying they had to come to agreements with us. Very little of it was ever paid for or agreed to, made it illegal for Indigenous people to gather to discuss our rights, to raise money to hire lawyers to fight for our rights, and to even go to court to fight for our rights until the 1950s. I often hear from people when I'm teaching, why are there so many land claims still? Well, this is why. So I say to people, when we talk about the myth of Canada the Good, Canada has this wonderful reputation. It's done a great job with propaganda, advertising to the world that it's this bastion of human rights, that, come to Canada, it's wonderful. And I hear from a lot of immigrants that I teach that, I came to Canada because it was such a beautiful country, because it's so good to people, because it's multicultural, I get to be myself. But then they come here and then they learn about how Canada has treated Indigenous people, and they say, that's why I left my country, because that's how I was treated in my country. But then I've come here to find out that this is how Canada treats Indigenous people. And then they're horrified to learn that Canada has lied to them about who it is. So this myth of Canada the Great is something that we all must learn and understand. We can see our neighbors to the south, the Americans, and their patriotism, and what happens with extreme patriotism, people who with guns and who are engaged in extreme violence in the name of patriotism, but ignoring actual education of their history and how the country was built. And we're starting to see more authoritarianism rise across the world, and here in Canada as well too. And it's scary to see, but we need to stop and think about who our country actually is, and to lift the veil, to learn about who we actually are, how we've actually been built, and why things are actually the way that they are. How have things come to this place, as opposed to just blindly believing in propaganda. And so let's move forward in learning a little bit about that. When we look at Indian agents were people placed on reserves who were a government enforcer. So there were people who enforced restrictions on the reserve, and all of them had spies who would work for them in the community. So they would watch and listen to help the Indian agent jail anyone who was suspected of asserting their rights. And I wanted to point out that the last Indian agent only left my reserve, Tyendinaga, in 1967. So when we think of them as being around a long, long time ago, historically, 1967 is not that long ago. That's my generations, my siblings, like when my siblings have been alive, 1967. So it's not that terribly historical when Indian agents have been around. One restriction I want to talk about, even though it's a bit of an exception, is the pass system. Because while it is not technically in the legislation of the Indian Act, it has had a massive impact on the Indian Act and the application of the Indian Act, because Indian agents and people on reserve were severely impacted by the pass system. And then, of course, this pass system was studied in Canada and then taken down to South Africa and implemented in apartheid as well, too. So it is an important one to know and understand about, because it had a very severe impact on the psychology and freedom and behavior of our people as well, too. And so here's an example of what a pass looked like. This one's from 1889. But after the 1885 Northwest Rebellion in the center of Canada, Indigenous people had to present a travel document authorized by an Indian agent in order to leave and return to their reserves. And so they might leave or return to their reserves to sell something that they had gardened, to sell cattle, to visit their children in residential school, to go to town to purchase wares. There's all kinds of reasons to leave the reserve, to visit family. So this was a way of controlling the movement of Indigenous peoples, and it was aimed to prevent large gatherings seen by many white settlers as a threat to their settlements. And they also didn't want a repeat of any rebellions after Louis Riel and his contemporaries were successful in their rebellions, somewhat successful. Colonial officials also believed that the pass system would prevent another conflict like those that had happened there. So used in conjunction with policies such as the Indian Act and residential schools, the pass system was part of an overall policy of assimilation. But what it also did was that it messed with people's minds because as other restrictions occurred over time, such as not being able to speak your language, not being able to practice your ceremonies, not being able to discuss your rights or raise money or hire lawyers, people were encouraged to not do any of those things as well, because if they wanted to get the pass to leave reserve from the Indian agent, they had to be seen as being good to the Indian agent. So they couldn't get in trouble for practicing their ceremonies or speaking their language if they wanted to leave the reserve to see their children in the residential school, for example. So it created these competing loyalties and exacerbated and increased the exponential assimilation of Indigenous peoples as well too. And it's, of course, had lasting effects on generations of status Indians. Over half a century of segregation and restrictions on mobility contributed massively to a loss of culture, strained family relations, and caused feelings of distrust, massive distrust towards government and police, and brought about socioeconomic inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, as well as between reserve and off-reserve communities. So of course, off-reserve communities did much better economically because they were able to travel freely, sell and buy things freely, where people on reserve, if the Indian agent didn't like them, were not able to buy and sell things as easily. So until recently, few Canadians were aware that the pass system even existed, and most were unaware that it was as widespread as it was. So what's also really interesting is that much like how the government of Canada wanted to destroy records of residential school survivors after the TRC, which is just appalling. Recent research has shown that the federal government made efforts to destroy any evidence of the pass system in Canada as well too. So this myth of Canada the Great, yet Canada is also trying to destroy its history of this contribution to genocide as well. And it is important that we know this because it's part of our history. And it's part of what has made Canada the way it is today. And so we all have a right to know what our history is. We all have a right to know why things are the way they are so that we can all contribute to solutions that make sense and that actually address the issues that we all have today. And Canada is trying to take that away from us. So a recent example, on or about 2018, a prominent activist in Tyendinaga was told by a parole officer that if he wanted to leave the reserve, he would have to get permission in advance of leaving the reserve in writing by his parole officer. Otherwise, he would be arrested. So that sounds an awful lot like getting a pass from his Indian agent, doesn't it? It was unbelievable that this happened. And of course, this was appealed through a Jordan's principle process. And of course, it was successful because just the thinking that like non-Indigenous people don't have to get a pass to leave their home when they're on, like they don't have to get a pass or they'll be arrested in the same situation, the way that he had to get a pass to leave the reserve. And there's no grocery store on the reserve. So, I mean, he might have to leave the reserve to get groceries, something as simple as that. And so this just simply doesn't happen to non-Indigenous people in the country. Another prominent component is enfranchisement. So this is a legal process, well, what Canada calls a legal process, even though it's not ethical. But this is what Canada calls a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status and what it calls conferring full Canadian citizenship. So enfranchisement was a key feature of the Canadian federal government's assimilation policies regarding Aboriginal peoples. And so what that means is that Canada didn't consider Indigenous peoples, status Indians, as being full Canadian citizens. They considered us as less than. So much like in the States where Black people, African Americans, were only considered 3/5 of a human. There was, a similar kind of idea here in place here. We weren't considered full humans or full citizens. We couldn't vote until 1960, for example. And so enfranchisement was, an argument to assimilation. So the government would trick some Indigenous people by saying it would grant enfranchisement to Indigenous people so that they could enjoy full Canadian citizenship. But really, it was a trick. So let's look at this a little bit more in depth. If First Nations peoples, otherwise known as status Indians, went to university or became soldiers in war, they were enfranchised. So this means that if they had a home and a land on reserve, they were taken away. They had to leave their communities financially poor, despite possibly being asset rich in their communities, as well as being surrounded by their families and their culture. However, what's interesting is that a lot of non-Native veterans returned home from the war were often granted 100 to 300 acres of farmland in honor of fighting for their country. And that was almost always Indigenous land that they were granted. So non-Native veterans got Indigenous land when they got back from fighting, but Indigenous veterans had their land taken away. And yet Indigenous peoples had the highest volunteerism rates of any group of people during the two Great World Wars. So consider how many settler Canadians have benefited for generations from the gift of family lands for the government of Canada, either from immigration waves or from post-war measures from such actions, while at the same time, Indigenous families have suffered from volunteering their commitment to honor the treaties by going off to war in droves at higher rates than anyone else in the country. And Canada's argument was, well, now you can be a full Canadian citizen now that you're not a status Indian. Now you can live in the country. But what this did was this marked the mass movement of Indigenous peoples to the cities after the two world wars. But the mass movement of Indigenous peoples in poverty because they were forced into the cities because of government legislation and practices. So we're going to pop over to Menti. So what comes to mind now when you think of the Indian Acts and its impacts? This is, I believe, another word cloud. So you can put in multiple submissions as well again. So I'm seeing genocide, control, systemic racism, dehumanization, damaging, broken, trauma, land theft, mistrust, cultural destruction, systemic violence, intergenerational trauma, embarrassment, dehumanization, discrimination, manipulation, second-class citizens, genocidal, denial of rights, colonial violence, restrictive, racism, absolutely, inhumane, shame, abuse of power, hypocritical, betrayal, absolutely. Okay, last call. Colonialism, of course. White supremacy, absolutely. Denial of true identity, yes. Colonial violence, cultural destruction, disgusting. Okay, I want everybody to take a good look at the words that are here right now. Take a good look. And I'm going to go back to another screen for you to compare. Okay. I'm going to go now. So look at these words and let's compare them to the two row wampum words that we had. And if you have a response to that, I just want you to put in the chat TRW for two row wampum. Put TRW and then any response you have to this juxtaposition. And then we can talk about it. I have a few more things before we wrap up, but then if you want to speak to it, you'll at least have noted it in the chat. I'll just give maybe a little bit longer and then I'll switch, I'll go forward again. Okay, I'm just going to put it forward if I can. Okay. So Duncan Campbell Scott, Indian Affairs Deputy Superintendent, about 100 years ago, said this: the government's goal was to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and that there's no Indian problem and no Indian department. So I want you to really listen here. I'm going to say it again. The government's goal was to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and that there's no Indian problem and no Indian department. I'm going to ask you to really take this in. I know this might be a trigger warning. Sorry, I should have said that first. My apologies. But I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to it here back on Menti. What emotions or physical sensations are sparked by this quote? The government's goal is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and that there's no Indian problem and no Indian department. Canadian Hitler. Yeah. Desperate white men. Slavery. Practice of genocide. Discrimination. I honor all of your feelings here, and want to give space for this here. I know you can input more than once. I'll ask for a last call here. But if you need more time, put it in the chat and Maria can let me know. Okay, last call. Okay, I'll go back to the presentation. And we're almost done. Actually, I want to say that thank you for sharing. I'm really honored that you all shared honestly there. But it's really important that we know this quote. I just want to go back to this quote really quickly. It's important for all Canadians to know this quote. So I encourage you to take a picture of it or write it down, because this philosophy is not just the philosophy that built the Department of Indian Affairs, as it was known for a century. This philosophy also built our government. This philosophy also built our governing structure, our so-called justice system, our educational system, our healthcare system, our economic structure. And so the philosophies that built all of these were formed over 100 years ago, around the time that Duncan Campbell Scott was around, the turn of the century. And these philosophies still permeate through Canadian society today. These philosophies impacted propaganda spread by the government of Canada, which continue to exist in stereotyping, racial issues. But what's more important is that they are embedded in the institutions that we live in and work in every single day. Because they've become so normalized for us, they seem invisible. But we know that they're not invisible. We know that they're there because we continue to have differential outcomes for Indigenous and other racialized peoples as well too, with our education outcomes, our economic outcomes, our health outcomes are considerably different. And in the so-called justice system, Indigenous and Black people have significantly higher rates of incarceration, longer rates of incarceration, and they're significantly just off the rails with how much more often they are arrested and are charged compared to non-racialized peoples. This is all because of philosophies that are embedded in quotes like this. And we need to understand this because we won't significantly change those rates and outcomes until we change those institutions. And we can't change those institutions until we know what philosophies built them. Only then can we sit back and reflect and be critical and consider a new philosophy to build the new institutions on that are more equitable for everybody. And this becomes really, really important for all of us. We're about at time, so there are so many more slides I could get to, but I think what I'm going to do is pop back over to Mentimeter. And ask you this. Because the Indian Act was designed to separate Indigenous people, specifically status Indians and settlers or immigrants, to keep us out of relationship with each other, what will you personally do to disrupt those systems that have been kept to keep us apart? And here you can write a few sentences or a paragraph, like a small paragraph, or just a sentence, whatever you want. What will you do to disrupt those systems? What action step will you take to start making a change? So I'm saying educate myself, use my voice, open the eyes of others, awareness. Think of a specific SMART goal that you can measure. Continue to share my culture in a safe environment. I like that. Keep learning about this and make sure my communities know about this. My voice is my sword. Advocacy, education, call local government. Yes, each and every one of you can call your MP and ask them to have me speak. I will educate all of them. Advocate for Indigenous rights, the historical context into revamping policies. Contact your MPP. So MP is for federal issues. MPPs are for provincial issues. So reserves are for federal issues. Consider these things when I vote? Absolutely. Get to know your MPs and your MPPs. They're supposed to be representing us, so we need to tell them what we want. Of course, we have more strength if we have people in our area sign petitions, because of course they'll pay far more attention to us if we say that we have 100 or 2 or 3 or 500 people in our area who are also interested in the same issue. I also work with Olivia Chow to teach people how to do that, but that's a whole other issue. So I won't talk about that today. I love to see, oh, my existence is my resistance. Yeah, love it. Do more critical thinking. Yes, please. I encourage all of you to be more critical in what you see in the news. Absolutely. And look at who the sources of information are. That's really important. And keep learning. And I'm available on LinkedIn at Dawn Maracle as well, if you want to reach out. Okay, Maria. So I will stop sharing here. I think hopefully the Menti will still work if people still want to chat. I'll leave my Menti up and stop sharing. Okay, so we have some time for chats. Maria, were there any things that popped out at you in the chat? Any big themes or comments?
There was I believe it was a question, and I'll just reread it. It says, okay. 614 bands in Canada refers to federally recognized bands. What about the others?
Yeah, well, there are more than 614 now. This was, I don't know when Canada put that up on the website because there are more than that now. So the Indian Act is only legislated for the ones that they recognize. Of course, there's far more communities that aren't recognized. And out of the 600 plus, I think it's like 637, however many recognized now, reserves. Some of the reserves have more than one landmass. So for example, Six Nations has the reserve, but then it also has an urban landmass, like where the Woodland Cultural Center is and the residential school. So it has like two separate chunks of land. So there are numerous reserves that have like more than one piece of land that are separate. So there are approximately 2,000 pieces of land that are covered under that within the Indian Act. It just doesn't say that on the website. So they're not doing a good job at communicating. And then there are also territories like Delgamuk's territory that was covered under their Supreme Court decision. That's not mentioned there because they're under a self-governing agreement. And in the Yukon, 11 of the 14 communities have self-governing agreements. I'm not sure how that's going to work now because they're governing themselves now. So that their website needs to be seriously updated.
There was just there was a few comments as you were presenting based on what you were presenting, but there was a comment most recently that said the two-row wampum seems to be a more coherent place for renewing Canada's nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. And that's what I advocate for. I advocate that we need to go back to our original treaties and that our original treaties are our roadmap for reconciliation, that they can teach us the values and relationships that are crucially needed to get us back to the place where we need to negotiate what our current and future needs will be.
Yeah. And I just, Dawn, if I may add, because, you know, one of the things that people often say is like, well, you just didn't have immunity to the diseases that were brought forward, right? So there was this large number of people who passed away. But I think it's important to also add that, that the people that passed away from the diseases that were brought, it wasn't so much that we didn't have the capacity to heal our people or to work with our people. It was the circumstances that were occurring during that time, all the trauma, all the violence, all of the stuff that was also happening that made us more susceptible to the diseases that were brought. Because sometimes people will be like, how can you help that though? And it's like, no, it's not just the disease, it's the context too, in which it's all happening.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna give everybody an opportunity. So if anybody has a pressing question they'd like to ask, well, here's one that came in just now. Why is there Native communities in BC that haven't signed treaties?
They came in and were recognized later. BC was populated and governed later than other nations. And not everybody wants to sign a treaty and not everybody's ready to sign a treaty yet. And so that's a process for every individual nation on their own time.
There's a comment that was sent to me and I'll just read it out loud. Create a more harmonious world if we can recognize our differences, acknowledge those differences, and respect those differences. We do this by asking questions, educating ourselves, and sharing that knowledge. This way we build trust, compassion, and empathy between all people. This creates mutual respect. Woo.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay.
However, you know, one thing I have learned is just knowledge doesn't create change. Knowledge makes us more knowledgeable, but then we also have to do actions that match our knowledge. And that's oftentimes where things are missing. So we have to walk our talk, and that's where the hard work is. For some people, it's hard to learn, but then it's also even harder to also then put it into action. And that's where we need to take those additional, more difficult steps.
I think there's a comment in the chat that says, I thought that the land isn't owned by anyone.
Well, it's communally owned by our cultural group. So not individually. Like Western concepts of land ownership are called fee simple, where individuals own land, as opposed to communal ownership, where Indigenous communities own land.
Yahweh. So, okay, does anybody else have questions or comments?
I'm open.
Dawn, can you, by any chance, just provide, you said LinkedIn, you're on Dawn Maracle, just in case anybody wanted to hire you as a speaker or to do consulting work?
Oh, wait, it turned out as a direct message, not a everyone. So just a second. Just so you know, I use Dawn Maracle because there are many, many Dawn Maracles. There's many on my reserve and a few on a bunch of other reserves too. So it has to be Dawn Maracle. That's me.
Okay. Well, Nyawe Goa, Dawn, for your words, for your presentation. For me, it's an essential part that we all need to understand, because sometimes we think we know what happened, but we're not. We need to really look at and take the time to listen to what actually unfolded and what was the intention, and to understand what's happening today. So I'm really grateful, and I want to say thank you to all the people who joined, who took the time to listen and continue to share the information and to take action. And we'll have these sessions ongoing where we're going to continue the work here. So you can always refer people. And I mean, Dawn is an incredible person that can definitely guide your organizations and agencies. So also, just remember, all of this historical stuff also exists inside of us. So it also pushes things up. So don't forget to take a breath, to take water. If you have your medicines, use those medicines, because you feel it pushes things up all the time. Go outside, feel that cold. That cold heals us so much because it helps us breathe deeply. And just take a moment to make sure that you can take care of yourself. And so I want to say to everybody, I wish you a good afternoon. And Ona Giwahe and Bama Pi and Chichlak Oba, take good care of yourself. And Yawagoa Dawn, and we'll be in touch soon, I'm sure.
Yes. And Maria, may you stay on for a moment with me?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yawagoa, everyone. Thank you. Take care of yourselves, and don't forget self-care. Nyawa, Ona.
Oi, sigurli, swagwag galahindi niyo gets. So, sorry, Mike, I didn't want to interrupt her talking, but I want to say Yanko for the raid, and thank you so much for bringing your community here. I appreciate that, and I hope that everybody got something from that. There's a couple of things I guess I was trying to make note of as we went along. Part of the way the discussion started out is with the land acknowledgement and how important it is for us to acknowledge the people um, in any particular area as being the hosts, and that's one of the things I think that she didn't really get across. And I think that oftentimes people do have a little bit of this concept of indigenous people are, are kind of the hosts across the entire Turtle Island. And the truth is that we were in areas of Turtle Island. So the Haudenosaunee people, which is where part of my background, primarily were in the area of like what is now known as the state of New York, and up into the part of Ontario. Now, we would be the hosts of this territory. So if even people who are indigenous come to this territory, they would still do a land acknowledgement in respect to the people, the Haudenosaunee or the Huron or the Anishinaabe or so the people of this territory. So land acknowledgements aren't restricted to non-Indigenous people to to say. Um, and then land acknowledgement is more than just acknowledging the history of the land, of the people who and the people who are there, but to acknowledge the people themselves and the fact that they are our hosts. And whenever you go to someone's home, you always respect that person's home, and you greet them, you say hello, and thank them for the invitation. Or sometimes people, if you go to a party, you take someone a bottle of wine or whatever it happens to be. There's always a certain way or a protocol that we use, typically just to show some sort of respect by bringing a gift or something like that. The other side of that is that the hosts, so for example, when the chief of Cowessess came, Cadmus Demore came to London to talk to our community, we put on a welcoming ceremony. So, because we are the host, and so as a host, you would be expected to greet people. You open the door and welcome them in. And so, in our tradition, we would have a sacred fire, we would have some medicines, and we would welcome the person to our community, as we did with Chief Cadmus. And so kind of goes both ways. I mean, it's just mutual. Again, it comes down to mutual respect. So if someone's going to travel halfway across the country to come and just do a talk in your community, you want to be respectful of their time, their efforts, and welcome them and give them a proper welcome. So that's one of the things about the land acknowledgements. So the other thing was the treaties that we talked about. The different there are treaties versus contracts. So when I used to talk about, say, what's happening out in the Wet'suwet'en, the fight for against the pipelines. Uh, the pipelines, uh, the territory of Wet'suwet'en is unceded, is what I call unceded, which means it doesn't fall under any treaties or contracts or agreements, which it sounds a bit redundant, but like she had mentioned, there is a difference between treaties and contracts. So with treaties, those are agreements that are made from nation to nation where both parties are considered to be equal. So when treaties were made historically, the indigenous people were considered to be equal to the settlers. Contracts are not necessarily the same. Contracts can be made by two parties. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter if they're equal or on any kind of similar level. They're contracts. So there's a difference between a contract and a treaty. So when we look at the treaties, which is um, what was signed, many years ago when settlers first started coming over, is that the indigenous people trusted that they were signing agreements on an equal basis, that we were um, equal and had as the same input into those contracts as the people we were signing them with, whether that was the Dutch or the English or the French or whoever it happened to be. When those treaties start getting um, broken, then they no longer become treaties as much as they are considered or being viewed as contracts. And contracts get broken all the time. Treaties should not. And that's the other thing. I think there was some really good coverage over when she was talking about the treaties and the process of the Indian Act from its embryonic stage to now, and the fact that we still have systemic racism happening today, and we're still having treaties broken today. And Wet'suwet'en was kind of one of those kind of prime examples, if you will, because the Canadian government, the Supreme Court of Canada, the colonial government, had already acknowledged and recognized that this land in Wet'suwet'en belongs to and is governed by the hereditary chiefs of Wet'suwet'en. So, for the Canadian government to allow its representatives, the RCMP, uh, to invade that land and forcibly remove the citizens of that land from their own lands, they're essentially breaking their own laws and their own agreements and treaties. So that is still happening today. In fact, some of the water protectors and land protectors that have been fighting for Wet'suwet'en just started their court cases last week in relation to these kind of farce charges that were put on them, because again they're on their own land. So what happens on that land is governed by the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in their traditional laws. So the RCMP coming out there essentially are overriding and breaking our traditional laws that govern that territory. And so um, I think that part of what the land protectors are trying to do is trying to not only protect the land, but at the same time do it in a system that was created by a colonial government, and do it in a way that will be cohesive for both sides. Um, we will see in time how well how well that works out. Um, I mean, if history tells us anything, um, it's going to be a long battle, and it's going to go on for some time. So I'm going to keep this VOD up. So if you missed any of it, um, you can certainly go back and watch what you can. The Indian Act, again, as she said, was created in 1876. It still exists today. There are still acts and laws within that, or kind of what do they? I don't, can't remember the term that they use, but there are still segments of that are set up in a way that still creates a door to systemic racism. And that's why many people believe either A, it needs a total revamp and reform, or B, it just needs to be abolished. Um, so that's going to be something that'll be a continual talk over, because the counter to totally abolishing the Indian Act is going to be, could potentially, in some people's minds, be counterproductive to creating a relationship between the indigenous and the colonial government. And the reason for that is that taking that out of the picture means that we've taken out a big chunk of agreements um, in legislation, which may or may not be for the benefit. Um, because if treaties have already been broken, and what little laws and kind of regulations that we have are based on the Indian Act, then removing that Indian Act removes that, it creates a bit of a free for all, or could potentially. So, so that's still up for much more debate and discussion as to whether or not it should be just completely abolished, or if there's a way of revamping it in a way that is, again, works for both sides of the nations, indigenous as well as the colonials. So for now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to end the stream. So if you have someone that you'd like us to raid, go ahead and post it, your suggestions in the chat. I'm going to play a rendition of the Peaceful Warrior. We always end the stream with a version of the Peaceful Warrior. And for those of you who do not know what the Peaceful Warrior is, if you're here for the first time, uh, put in a little blurb there. And let me get in here And so I can pull one of these up. Um, I will. Oh, this one I haven't played for a while. I'll play the version by Sherry Smith Music. Um, there are something like 20 renditions of this song done by various uh, streamers. And I think that I'm honored that they all have joined their voices and in a common theme of trying to create some unity amongst people. And I think that ultimately is our goal is to make things more harmonious, just like my mission statement says. So I'm going to play the Sherry Smith rendition of the Peaceful Warrior. So I'm going to get my face off the screen here, first of all. And I will get this. And again, if you have suggestions, go ahead, throw them in the chat. And then, and I think I might come back tonight and do a music stream because haven't done that. Um, and then we'll continue from there. So let me go ahead and get this here started.
My name is Sherry, I'm at war for equity and peace. All these census attacks I see must halt, desist and cease. So what I'm doing here, what I really want to say is the world has got to change its unforgiving way. Talking about all the people from the ocean to the skies. I'm talking about the real issues from the truth to all the lies. I'm gonna make my stand with a paper and pen. If you argue with that, then go back to bed again. Oh yeah. Let's keep passing our knowledge and information so we can improve this planet through truth and education. Somebody's gotta make the people aware. Someone's gotta make everybody care. So pass on my message if you dare. My name is Sherry, I'm at war for equity and peace. All these census attacks I see must halt, desist and cease. I'm going to battle for the red, white, yellow and black. I'm gonna fight for the ones who can't fight back. Fight for the women with no rights to their bodies. Fight for the people for whom nobody lobbies. Fight for the people who fear being themselves. And fight for the earth upon which we all dwell. There's more power in one man's voice than all the weapons of military choice. So with my voice and yours, we can shout out loud. We belong to the human race, and we are proud. You don't have to be a master of science to see we need a worldwide alliance. We've seen how the world can be devastated through actions of men with minds of hatred. Oh yeah. My name is Sherry, I'm at war for equity and peace. All these census attacks I see must halt, desist and cease.